和田。はい。So the motion the theme is グラファイっぽいやつ。今何時？今12時53分。So 11時53分。13時53分。So the day will start at 14時8分。If my math is correct. Anyway, motion. This has preferred the world with one unified currency.
こちらでこそ、はい、はい、はい、はい。
海外旅行
ウィンドウキャプチャー。ウィンドウキャプチャーで、まあ、だってまだ早いし。いつか。 動画の編集はできない。間違えた。あ、ディベーターにさ、
どうしたって
コミっぽい雰囲気。コミなんですけど。サウスプレハー、プレハー。ミッドコインモーションですね。ミッドコインモーション。
ジョイフルの方がいいですか。間違い探し誰が違うの？
タイムラグか。他にしよう。帰ろうとしすぎやろ、お前ら。すげえ帰ろうとしてるやん。サイゼリアにあんの？めっちゃ帰るやん。びっくりするわ。
だから一応国境における世界で自分の国内で全部人権利にして、この国とやり取りします。まあだからミスをするとか、すげえ困り全然わかんないから多分インターしてて。高橋さん、これ公開許可もらったんですか、ディベーターの。これコメント流れるようにできないんですか、こうニコニコみたいに。こう出てくるんですか。ああ、横に。N タこんにちはって書いてるじゃないですか。
マジ PP 必要だわ。他にも道があるな。
やばいと思うんだけどね。
その道だから俺は来週からって上がってこない限りはダメなんですよ。
充電しながらしたい。
あ、俺もしたいそれ。ちょ。あー、でもここは回りすぎる。おお。あ、じゃあちょっとこれが。こっちの方がいいですよ。ぐるぐるにならない。届かなかった。完璧。完璧。
それはね。
俺ら学んでし
第二ジャッジ。これでグラファイでジャッジできたらもう終身名誉正雄になれる。終身名誉正雄。
多分あれですよ。名誉かどうかわかんないですけど、終身正雄であること間違いない。
本当にこいつ正雄じゃない。間違いない。電源があるから。ここに電源があるから。ここに電源があるから。子供を借りてまでみたいな。すごく頑張り偏ってる。 側に偏った位置。この先輩
ほら、なんかジャッジじゃないような顔してここ座ってればディスカッションに呼ばれないかもしれない。
ヘッドホンつけて。
あ、でもあれですよ。
でもなんか通じるかどうかわかんないんだけど、親がマジ？いや、なんか泣いてない、泣いてる書いてない。なんか国際関係に対するものは、なんかパブリック
意味がわからない。むしろ俺らの位置が正しくなってるんですよ。あいつはちょっと前すぎる。あいつの前ちょっと前すぎる。
なんかフロージングに肩入れしてるみたいな。
もう一個後ろだよね。あと一人じゃん。4楽は別になんかクロージングじゃないの。
4楽は京都 A じゃないです。
もう時間過ぎてるな。
酒井さんジャッジ入った？
高橋さん入らないです。
帰ってくれ、帰ってくれ。わかんない。マジで帰れない。じゃあそろそろやります。Preparation time has expired, so welcome to the grand final of Japan National 2018. Congratulations to all teams that proceeded so far. We have HC for opening government. We have QUA for opening opposition. We have Tokyo A for closing government. We have WAD A for closing opposition. Judging this round, me, and from the right side, Tamura-kun, Kaido-kun, John-san, Mark-san, Koki-san, Sakurai-san. This. So, without any further ado, I'd like to call up the Prime Minister to open your case for 7 minutes. Here.
There are types of currency in the world, and we think that the entity which can control the value of this country currency is the only powerhouse like US or China. And we think that this, because of existence of multiple currency, it is used as a way of exploitation of small countries. But we think that basically this is very unfair for these small companies and principally that's the reason why we propose this motion. In my speech, I'm going to talk about 2 things. So firstly, why under the current situation, most of countries have no control over these currencies, and why this is actually used as a way of exploitation, and secondly, why this is actually principally bad. So today our model is quite simple. So as a motion says, we support the one unified currency in the world. We think that if we introduce this one unified currency, that no entity can have the control over this currency, and the exploitation will never happen. We want to my substandard. Thank you. First of all, so I'm going to analyze the current status quo. So opposition side might say that each country should have the right to control their currency. But we think that under the current situation, actually these small, basically almost all countries have no power to change the value of the currency. This is because actually they're out of there are powerhouses like US or the China, and they have very strong influence in the international world, and this kind of big market are actually forcing these small countries to not control the value of the currencies. So actually, in the past, the Venezuela tried to change the value of the currency, but because of this forcible power from the market, they failed to change their value of currencies. Then, given that in the current situation, who has the control over the currency? This is a big the country which has a big economic power like US or China, right? So they and the national bank of the US or China has a really big influence inside of the international society. So, for example, actually in the current situation, a lot of countries start to don't recognize Taiwan, but actually recognize China because China declares that we don't like to access the Chinese currency unless you recognize China and so forth. And because China has a very strong power inside of the market, inside of the international entity, and because there are need to accept the Chinese currencies, these small countries are forced to accept these powerhouses' demand. And yes, we think that in that kind of context, the exploitation can very easily happen. So, in that context, we think that these strong companies can easily and selfishly use the value of currency as a way of exploitation. For example, if they want to get the bigger benefit by the trade, they can actually force the other countries to accept the reasonable, which is the beneficial value of the currency for the China or US. So that's why we think that under the current situation, only this big country has the power to control the currencies, and it is actually used that way of exploitation. And secondly, why this is principally bad. So in the first place, we think that each country has the right to freely access to the international business or freely access to the fair trade. So that's why in the current situation, actually, the international society is allowed the selfish act of each country. For example, Donald Trump are going to set the very selfish restriction on the trade for the sake of the profit of US. But actually, international society criticizes him, and we are trying to promote the fair trade inside of the world. So like this, since basically each country has the right to access to the fair trade or fair international business, actually we are trying to guarantee that. But as I said, because there are multiple types of the currencies, the only big country can have the power to control that, and then systematically the exploitation can very easily happen. And then if the other countries don't follow the policy of the US or China, they can easily force them by using their currencies. So from these reasons, we think that actually because of the existence of these multiple currencies, the other countries like to enter to international business or fair trade is actually violated. That's why we think that since this is actually principally bad, we support the one unified currency. And if we, as I said, if we introduce this one unified currency, then actually no one can control this kind of currency, and there's no bank which can actually change the value of these currencies. So we simply after taking policy, the exploitation will never happen, and we can guarantee to each company's life. So from these reasons, we think that one unified currency is really, really beneficial to the entire world. And more than that, we think that simply the existence of multiple currencies is very, very harmful, and it takes out the cost. So we need a lot of transaction in order to change the currency. We have to prepare a lot of labor costs, or we have to supervise the ratio of money, exchanging money, and so on. And we simply we think that it will cost a lot, and this is very ineffective. That's why also we think that one uniform currency can solve this kind of problems. For this reason, we think that there's no benefit of keeping the multiple currencies, and only by introducing unified currency, we can expect out of benefit. That's the reason why we propose this motion.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Now I invite the leader of opposition to give your opposition case for 7 minutes. Here.
Panels. The opening government tried to protect this weak country to say that if in the status quo they're oppressed, they're controlled by US and China. We believe that that is true to some extent. But what they are doing is stripping off the last defense against the foreign influence. Because we believe that if we take this motion, those powerful nations have more control on those poor nations that have less power to negotiate and have less power to control the global currency. Very proud to oppose. So first, several clarification to the model provided by the opening government. The opening government didn't tell us, so after taking the plan, who will be able to print new money? So we believe that if they didn't provide anything, we would try to provide something, right? So we believe that under this, in this motion, there are two possibilities. The first is there will be an organization built by the international society that is led by US, by China, by the powerhouse that they mentioned in the first day to decide how much money we will release to the global market. And second circumstances is that on their side, every single country will have their own freedom to print this kind of global currency. We say that in both paradigms, it's extremely harmful and counterproductive towards their goal. So first, let's talk about the second possibility, which we think is less realistic, right? If every single country is able to print a global currency, which means that if there are some corrupt leader want to to print more money to use to fix all those debts, what this we see in the cases of some I forgot the Zimbabwe, yeah. So what will happen is that the whole global economy will be impacted by the entire inflation of just because the problem of one single country. So we believe that on that paradigm, it is very possible for one country to destroy the whole economy of our global trade. Then second, on the more realistic model, right? If we give those powerhouse a union of powerhouse, for example, China, United States, and EU, this power to decide how can they control the global currency, that is that will be more problematic. So several things that we'll talk about. So first is what is the distinctive difference between two paradigms, and second, what is the unique benefit of this kind of a sovereign currency, and what is the harm of making those people in power to control this kind of currency? No, thank you. So what we get in the status quo? In the status quo, we have when we are trading, we primarily use the US dollar. So what they might talk about, the efficiency of trade would not be a concern in this debate, because anyway, we are using US dollar or euro or RMB or JPY as a primarily trade. So that does not cause inefficiency from their side of house. And so what we believe, the only distinction here is that now some small countries that using their monetary policy control to to manipulate their own domestic market will lose the ability to have our own currency.
Wait.
Yes.
So the model that we support is one that we have, for example, like a central bank that is independent of nations and that is centralizing all the, the creation of this money.
So the problem came, who controls the central bank? We believe that in the end of the day, there will be corrupted leader control the central bank or the powerful nations and powerful capital to control the central bank. Doesn't see any distinction from that model. Then moving on to my argument on what is the unique benefit and why on their side it will be jeopardized, right? We believe that the country on principle level have a sovereignty under control of their monetary policy. Like we believe that the only criteria when you can intervene the sovereignty of a country is, for example, there are humanitarian crises. For example, the country are torturing people, are killing people. That when the government fail to achieve its goal of protection. Obligation of protection, like we can interpret with the sovereignty, right? But we believe that in this kind of situation, despite of the practical outcome of the monetary policy, the country that are controlling their own domestic policy are completely legitimate on the principle level. And secondly, on the practical level, we believe that that it is less possible or less likely for those international, like for example, the union of China and United States and EU to better control the policy of monetary policy of independent nations. Because two levels. So first, that they have less knowledge on what is the short-term goal and long-term goal, and what is the problem that those countries are facing uniquely. And second, those countries, those rich countries are always like consider about their own benefits, so they do not have any incentive to make money policy that is more beneficial to those independent nations. So that's why we believe it's less likely for them to provide better monetary policy, like control the world as a whole. And also we believe that there are different necessity for different nations. For example, as a fast developing nation, they need to bring more money to get some extent of natural inflation. But for some nations, they want to keep the currency key. But if they make a global currency, then those nations' goal cannot be achieved mutually exclusive way. So that is why we say there is a necessity for those countries and a legitimacy for those countries to control their own currency. Thirdly, what is the harm after imposing this kind of thing? So we believe that after we take this motion, when this currency is controlled globally, those people who are in power will be able to dictate where the money will go and what will be the global way of using the money. We already see that in how the way that the WTO is operating. Those big members in the WTO do not have a voice, they're disproportionately muted, because even they want to voice out something, it can be those rich nations will justify. For example, the EU can say that when they're selling something, it's legitimate, but when other small countries are selling things, it's like dumping or things like that. So we believe that the same thing will happen after we have a global currency, and even a global council that has that discuss how the money will go will not work on their side. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close the OG case for 7 minutes.
I'm going to talk about a few things in my speech. Firstly, about the clarification on model and why we felt that we didn't have a need to justify justify it. Secondly, a rebuttal to their point about sovereignty. And lastly, to talk about why our side allows for more economic development and economic benefits for all countries. So first, let's just talk about like what opening opposition essentially conceded to, right? They told us that rich countries do not have an incentive to make monetary policy that is for the benefits of smaller countries. This means that in this paradigm, in the context that my first speaker just explained to you, which is where only the US and only China have effective control over their own currencies, that these countries have an undue amount of influence on the entire global economy. Right? They don't have an incentive in the current paradigm to actually create policies that are favorable for countries like in Africa or more smaller developing countries. And we think it's unfair for these people to hold so much power, and that was the problem that we were trying to solve. And then they came up to tell us that, oh no, your model, because we didn't clarify anything, right, is actually going to allow for these countries to consolidate their power. Ironically, America and China are even going to have more power under your paradigm. That's simply not true. So the reason why we didn't feel that we needed to identify our policy is because we thought that we would just follow unified currencies in the rest of the world, right? Sure. So our model is simply going to follow a very intuitive model similar to the European Central Bank. What happens in the European Central Bank is not that Germany has an undue influence over how much euros you're going to print. The European Central Bank is completely independent and is not held with political office. It's a group of technocrats who decide and are central bankers, and so there's not going to be political influence, right? This means that what they were saying, the problems that exist on their side is not the same, right? And the decision makers that are making this are going to be neutral and more likely to think about overall development of the international community. Even if they talk about how, oh, the decision makers are going to be more influenced by America and the US, the problem that we're talking about is not that America and the US, like the US and China uniquely have an ability to decide how much currency to print. It's about the problem of access and value. What do we mean by this? My first speaker told you that a lot of countries now are dropping recognition of Taiwan in recognition of China because they want more access to renminbi. Because inherently, because certain countries are more dominant in the global economy, you have to tender and have to receive their currency to do business with them, right? As a company in Japan, if you have no access to US dollars, it means you're cut off from the rest of the global economy. As a small country in Southeast Asia, if China doesn't allow you to use renminbi to effectively get renminbi, you cannot tap into the Chinese market. This cuts you out from the economy. The fact that governments like the US and China have the ability to decide who gets to participate in the international community or who gets to participate in regional economies is ridiculous. We don't think that should be allowed. So what changes on our side is that there's no country that can say you don't get access to a certain currency. That is why we think we deserve no thank you. Next, on their point about sovereignty. My first speaker already preempted this, right? He told you that countries don't have effective control over their currencies in the first place. Why? Principally, first of all, because we already recognize in status quo that it's not okay for a country to artificially devalue their currency so that their goods can be more, so that their exports can be more competitive. Why? How does this take place? Right? They said, well, it should be perfectly fine for each country to decide, like, if they want a lower and cheaper currency. That's not even the case. First of all, most countries don't have the foreign reserves to even maintain and make sure that their currency is that cheap. But more importantly, right, we think that in general, the global economy doesn't allow you to artificially manipulate. Global norms don't allow you to artificially manipulate your currency if this has a negative impact on the global community, which means, like, it causes an unfair trade advantage to your country, right? So sovereignty on their side is not a benefit that exists. But more importantly, the only people that can influence and use sovereignty and can control what happens in the global economy are these larger economies, right? So smaller countries in their side completely die and actually don't have sovereignty because they can be arbitrarily cut off, right? If Kosovo doesn't recognize China, China is just never going to get Kosovo any access to renminbi, and Kosovo is just going to be shut out of the global economy. It's ridiculous and principally unjust that a few global players can choose who has access to international finance and who does not. That's why we think that sovereignty is stronger on our side, because we protect the sovereignty of smaller states, which needs protecting in the first place. Why are they protecting the sovereignty of the US and China that's going to have sovereignty anyway? We have no idea. What do we mean, right? So again, like I already clarified to you, what do we mean by China and the government have like an unfavorable power? It's about access to the global economy, and we think it's a consensus and a norm that everyone should have equal access to participate in international trade. Having said this, let's talk about development of countries and development of economies. First speaker already told you, right? He told you there's a transactional cost when you change currency. I'm going to talk more about why a general central currency will allow for better economic development for countries in general. We think small countries now have two options. One, they opt in to use a former colonizer's currency, or they use like a currency that's dominant in the world. So for example, in Africa maybe, people are using the renminbi, or they're using the US dollar, or they're using even sometimes, possibly like the euro to transact business. And all official business transactions are conducted in their currency. So one, they opt for an external currency that they have no control over, or two, they use their own currency, which may be not change and may be very turbulent. Both cases are really bad for allowing these countries to gain control over their economic development. Whenever you import and export something out of the country, you have to change your currency. Like in the first scenario, where they opt for an external kind of currency, I already told you why that's really problematic, because it means that their economic survival is based on their ability to get access to their currency. That's really problematic, because it means it ties them to their former colonizers, or it ties them to their country, and they're very reliant on that. That's terrible. It reduces their sovereignty. More importantly, if they don't opt for this, if they have their own currencies, the problem is this means they have no bargaining power in whatever international kind of use. If a small country says, oh, I don't like my neighbor, and I'm not going to give my neighbor access to my currency, that doesn't matter, because their neighbor can just do business with any other country that exists, right? And they can just ignore this small country. So small countries have no bargaining power to use their currencies. If there are POIs from closing, I'll take you. Okay, so basically, what happens when they use their own central currency? They have no bargaining power over how this currency converts. And more importantly, what happens is that big investors that come in, who have the foreign capital, who have companies, can easily manipulate the value of these countries, right? If you are a Chinese big corporation and you're looking at a small African country like Angola, for example, you can very easily distort the currency by putting in a lot of investment or taking away a lot of it. Also, it's possible that this currency may be unstable due to civil unrest or instabilities in the government. What this means is either small countries choose to use someone else's currency, or they have a very unstable currency. That's never a good path to economic development, because as long as your currency is unstable, if investors know that if they throw money into your country, tomorrow it might be valueless, or tomorrow the value might suddenly drastically change. There's no incentive for people to make long-term contracts, no incentive for people to invest in these countries, and we think it's fundamentally problematic for long-term growth. What has my side shown you? My short side has shown you that, first of all, no one actually has control of their currency except the really big players whose sovereignty we don't need to provide anyway. Sovereignty part on the opposition side already killed. But more importantly, we told you that in general, for equality within economic trade and for access to the international market, it's really important to have this unified currency. For these reasons, cross-propose.
Thanks, BPM. Now move on to Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the opening half for 7 minutes. Yeah.
So what is the comparisons in this debate? We have compared the paradigm where nations have their own currency and they can control the value and how the money flows in their own nations. Compared with the world, when they have a very neutral central bank who decide how many money, how much money they can print, how the money going to flow, and decide which they should, which country, how many money the country can hold to some extent. So given that kind of scenario, I will show you one deeper characterize how the world in government side look like and why it's a bad decisions and why it's a bad work in the first place, and preemptively talk about the FGK when we have a central neutral bank to some extent. And second of all, when we talk about why in case of something, for example, economical crisis, when we need a very quick and emergency decisions to whether or not the value of a national need to be flexibly changed, why it's actually much more better for a nation to can decide how many decide the value of their own money in the first place. But before that, let's talk about the opening government side case. Number one, they run away from the question and run away from the class that opening opposition bring out for in this debate, because they say instead of China and US, we'll make some kind of neutral central bank in the first place to decide how much money we can do in the first place. Number one, who are they? How they can actually work in the currency in their side of the house, and what is the incentive to actually do this kind of thing? Because in the first place, even if we have the same currency money, the strong country are still remain strong. US and China are still remain strong. They still have the other way in order to empower the bargaining power and to block out the other nation from the society. For example, soft sharp power or soft power, they can affect the cultures or they affect the political inside some nation to block out the kind of thing. So we don't think just superficially make all the money unified in the first place, can just simply block out all and stop this kind of nation to control the central bank and make some kind of corrupted things, for example, block out some nations. So we don't think and we don't buy the analysis of a fair chase coming from the opening government to some extent. Second of all, when they talk about the model, they said we will just spread out the model of European to some extent to the whole world. the problem that like the reasons why European model is success in the first place because all the nations, approximately all the nations in European have the same living standard. They share the same value. Like that is to say, a certain stuff in this nation and the other nation have the same value and have the same amount of money. But when it's spread out to the world, when they have a wider spectrum, that to say a very rich nation and like a certain stuff is very expensive compared with like the other nation that doesn't actually cost so much, like about a food or something like that. When the nation actually have a more agriculture base and the others doesn't have quite so much base, it means that like in this kind of thing, like it's much more harder for the central bank to decide like what is the neutral values for this kind of thing to be changed off and to be spread out to some extent. And because there is arbitrarily decide a certain value for a certain thing, meaning like they also block out a certain people from obtaining that. They block out the poor of the poor because with the same currency, they didn't actually gain enough amount of money to buy the certain stuff that are in a very neutral light to some extent. No, thank you. So that therefore we don't think that like this kind of model is actually better economic development and actually like cheaper and better tackle that the problem of like strong country like control the money flow. But rather than that, as my partner already told you, it's actually create a better and stronger tool for like the nation like China or US to use that and like easy to influence the other small nation and easy to use that as a means to like oppress the other nation and block them out in the first place. But before me go on, closing if you have any.
The price differences in Turkey and Netherlands are very noticeable. They're very different living standards within the European Union. But they choose to forego that for a universal currency so that there's no transactional cost when doing business, so that there's no uncertainty in currency and that investment can occur better and the region can develop economically.
Okay. Number one, like, yep, there might be used European currency as a way to check with other nation, but this doesn't mean like that is the only currency that they have in their own nation in the first place. Internally, inside this nation, they also have a different, their own currency to some extent to check internally, and thus they have the value, and then they have decide the value of that currency to some extent. So we don't buy the idea like, like just make the currency for internally and externally all the same, can actually much more better in just how. So with that being given, so let's try to like deeper and creatively make a closing comment about like how they will look like. So in the best case, there will be a kind of like central bank who decide how many money they will print and like to decide like how much money they need to cater to a certain nation. Which means that like they also need to consider about a certain context of every nation in the current situation. We don't think that like they have enough capacity to consider that given the wide spectrum of a nation from South Africa to America to some extent. Means that like to a certain context and to a certain extent is less that it take a long process for the central bank to decide and to have this kind of nation in the first place. What kind of situation we're talking about? We're talking about economic crisis when like the value of nation just like immediately drop out, when like certain product can actually become extremely expensive of certain nation, and then to some extent it's very cheap to the other nation in the first place. In that kind of circumstance, the nation, even if they're very corrupted, also need to hold their sovereignty and also need a quick response to this kind of thing by let's print out the money or like actually print out more money in the first place, to like compensate and balance out the value of their own nation, to actually self-sustain their own nation in the first place. We think that is crucial because they are the elected to understand the situation of that nation. They understand the living standard generated of that situation in the first place. So that's why they can tackle that with us much more better than like a BG central bank who still remain controlled by the US. And even if in the best case, they can actually find a better way. What is the incentive in the first place when they are under control of US or China? I just say when Taiwan like actually become corrupted and like some bankruptcy, and like China still holding the central bank. What is the incentive of the central bank to have Taiwan in the first place? So we don't think any kind of sovereignty form. That's how. With that being different, I think that like the biggest question here, like who is the actor who can control the money in the first place? We say like even if in the worst case, like something like Zimbabwe to some extent, but still like because they understand their ownership, like they actually can decide what kind of money they have in the first place. It's much more better compared to the one-sided thing coming from opening government, where like they try to make every nation to opt into a certain value and to a standard that like not every single people in this world can actually opt in the first place. So I still have 30 seconds of what I should say. Okay, so lastly, when they talk about the budget and everything, it's actually much more better in the budget. We don't buy this kind of analysis to some extent. Why is that so? Because even if we have a certain amount of same, like a certain a unified currency in the first place, still like the value of like the good is still different from nation to nation. Like I say, you still can buy cheaper from a nation, and you still can exploit from the poor country to some extent in the first place. We don't see any kind of sovereignty and any kind of change in their work in terms of budget in the first place. What we said in the opening of portion, we say countries need to have their own sovereignty of the currency because they are the best actors to decide and to have and to remain and compensate the value of their own nations. Very proud to stand in the round fighter.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now move on to closing half. I invite a member of government for a speech for 7 minutes. Yeah.
No one in this debate talked about what currency actually is. Currency is a tool for transaction, but what gives currency the power and trust is exactly the trust, right? We trust this money because this money has background justification. When it comes to the current situation, that this justification is dispersed in many countries, each and every single country depending upon every single other individual country. We think that situation is extremely fragile. That's exactly where countries and individual investors and transaction makers tend to be selfish, because the only way possible to protect that their own currency is not to trust the central authority, but to self-defend themselves. That's exactly why when it comes to crisis, in times of crisis, people certainly extract money from that nation and sell that money in order to get their own benefit and protect their own currency, not really trusting any central organization to do something about it. That exacerbates that crisis, that kills one nation just in the same way it actually did in the past. We think that exactly is a problem of many currencies existing in our society. We'd rather unify that into one single central authority that people can trust, people do trust. We think that that's why we're very happy to stand on the closing proposition. So it's two things, right? First of all, I'm going to examine the nature of currency and why we can create better society in which people trust central authority for doing something against crisis and so forth, and why we think that is a far more stable society. And secondly, I'm going to specifically talk about crisis because that's the main obstacle of nations' development, because that kills individuals. Currency is not just a tool for transaction, it's already deeply connected to people's lives on the ground and bread on the table, right? Before that, basically a couple of responses to opening opposition. Now, first thing of the opening opposition said that individual countries, especially small countries, will lose control of their currency. Now, firstly, we have to recognize that individual, for example, central authority do have some supplement measures and make suboptimal situation in that region. For example, in Japan, when one city is in a crisis or about to have a crisis, the central authority can actually do something, right? For example, capital injection or trying to increase consumption by increasing building roads and ports, so forth, and attracting investment in the region, right? So we think that individuals still have chance, that countries still have chance to get out of that, and thank you, even if that control is to a certain extent lost. And also we think that individual, for example, central authority banks like what we're talking about today, like European banks, for instance, can control interest rate for that, for that country, to the extent that countries can get out of that crisis and like have stable development again, right? And also they talked about prices are different from countries and that's bad. Now, what Jamie told you in the POI was really critical, right? We think this is good. We think that price in Tokyo and price in Saga, where I'm from, should be different because the living standard in those two regions is quite different, right? We think it should be a bit more expensive to buy homes in Tokyo than in Saga. We think that's perfectly alright. We don't see any problem associated with that. These are the rebuttals to the opening opposition. Now, first, let me examine the nature of currency, right? So as I told you in the introduction, currency is ultimately, like, without any justification behind that currency, it's just a piece of paper, nothing else, right? What gives currency the power is a trust. Right now, at the moment, each and every single country giving their own trust to their own small currency, including like very small Turkish lira and so forth, right? But that thing is, those currencies are mutually depending on each other without having central authority that individual investors or individual holders of currency can trust. Why is it bad? Firstly, we think that this is extremely fragile, right? Because many times it is dependent upon political situation of one nation. That's what came from opening proposition. But furthermore, we like to identify that impact transcends from one nation to other nations. What am I talking about exactly? For example, when it comes to one region controlled by one single currency, like one single state in the United States of America, just because, for example, Pennsylvania shifted from Democrat to Republican, it didn't change the economic situation of Pennsylvania that much. But when India decides to get in one belt and one road strategy, that affects not only India but also all the other countries associated with that, because that currency that every single other nations around have is actually dependent on that currency that India is having right now at the moment. That's exactly the mechanism through which individual political situation affects the entire global economy and the status quo. We think that's bad. When it comes to, on our side of the house, after taking this position and so forth, that story, international organizations are willing and are able to control that. It represents basically everyone. It is trusted because betraying the central organization and acting selfishly can cost too much for those individual nations, right? That's exactly the mechanism through which we can achieve better sustainable development and sustainable economy. Yes?
We said that in case that Africa and US have need in different monetary policy, the central bank will pay policy that in favor of US. Please engage with that.
Well, we don't really think so, and also we think that is totally non-mutually exclusive, as opening proposition already put to you. Already, big countries are controlling the economy right at the moment. There will be no distinction whatsoever. But furthermore, I will talk about the crisis, right? Mutual dependency based on selfishness is bad. Because when you think about situations, it's already a money game, right? Exchanging currency from one to another, and why is it bad? If one country fails, the effect is so huge, right? Because individual investors try to exchange their money into something else, and meaning the fact that currency of that one single nation becomes far, far weaker because of that, having different currencies, right? They are unable to get foreign currency, their domestic policies become meaningless because that country's trust as a whole will decline in the status quo, right? Why is it important? Because they will get in a vicious cycle when their currency itself becomes weaker, right? On our side of the house, at least every single corner of that globe share the same currency, meaning the fact that individuals are more likely to have collective interest in saving one nation and trusting the central authority for doing something instead of trying to protect their own benefit of their own currency by themselves by extracting resources from one single nation, substantially making it harder for those individual countries to get out of that crisis. We think that affects individuals' lives on the ground. We think this issue is the most important. We have to stand on the proposition.
Thank you, Member of Government. I invite the Member of Opposition to deliver your extension for 7 minutes. Here.
we prefer the status quo far better than unified currency, even if there is a flaw in a status quo and nice to say diversified currency. I think there isn't a mere lie from the opening government that says European Central Bank is completely independent from other countries, right? All kind of touch this argument that strong countries dominate the central bank, but there was no reasoning on that. Or we just explain, well, there is no independent central bank or so on and so forth. I'm going to explain the very reason why there cannot be the existence of independent central bank, right? European Central Bank is the accurate action that victimized and made South Europe very poor. Because if we see the Greece case, Greece citizens on the ground have hugely criticized what Germany have done. Because Germany, that they are providing the monetary policy in favor of North parts, for example, the Netherlands as well as Sweden or so forth, right? On that occasion, we cannot say that there's a completely independent central bank in its first place. That's a rebuttal towards the OG. And OG was really, really good at explaining A, how the one country destroys whole economic policy. Well, the one country might destroy whole economic regime, and also B, how the goal that countries have will not be achieved. We in closing opposition is going to further extend and will examine about the exploitation problem, whether or not small countries will be exploited. I'm going to examine rather small countries will be helped in our side of the house, and moreover, why this is comparatively better than unified currency. Because nobody in this debate was not comparative of why diverse currency is better than unified one, right? That's why I'm going to examine that. Given that I have two arguments in my speech, first I'm going to tell you that this prevents the exploitation from small countries, because the main argument coming from the OG, that is, this argument will directly crush the OG, was diversified currency exploits small country, which I don't think so. I'm going to prove and destroy why exploitation would rather occur in their side of the house and why in our side of the house, small country, that is, developing countries are helped. But secondly, I will also tell you, is the central bank in their side God? Because the argument from that side of the house, they're completely relying on the central bank in the first place. And without telling us why in the first place, I'm going to prove why this is a lie and why they are not God. We're going to first idea about the small countries argument, right? That side of the house mentioned that exploitation to small country will happen. We rather think a small country will lose their autonomy in their side of the house from the beginning. All kind of touched up, but was not pushed out and never fulfilled the reason why each country should be able to access this the monetary autonomy and impact on that. I'm going to fulfill this burden. We think the very reason why it should not be unified is because A, they lose the autonomy of using their money. Reason why states can make the economic policy as well as the fiscal policy that as they want to is because they are able to have their own central bank, right? For example, Sweden, they want to ensure the welfare for the citizens. That's why they are controlling their own central bank, right? But what's gonna happen in that side of the house is even if the Sweden as well as the other country that wants to introduce the welfare system will be rejected because the central bank would say, no, look at this economic crisis that's currently happening in the world. I cannot give you any more money or so on and so forth. Right? There is a negotiation power between the strong country and small country. On that occasion, we think the small country comparatively cannot even access to the autonomy that they want to have. Sit down. B, also current diversified currency is far better because government didn't really talk how unified currency will work and better off for small country. They just say status quo is failing, right? Without telling us why and why that's comparatively better in the first place. Developing nations are helped because they can't trust in an alternative way. For example, countries like Venezuela or Turkey, they are currently in a financial crisis. But the only reason why they are able to opt out from the currency is because they have an alternative currency such as US dollar or Japanese yen, right? On the occasion, we think it's better for them to be able to have an alternative from the beginning. Moreover, we tell you foreign currency from other countries by giving by the trade even to the developing nation is also giving a power and a trust to those small countries. We don't understand why current currency is that bad, and they're not evil from the beginning.
So there being alternative is exactly the problem, because investors are extracting money, exchanging that currency into another, meaning the fact that those countries' currency is simply being weakened and have any autonomy to get out of that situation, right?
I think that's how economy works. And if the currency is not trustable, they should fail from the beginning. We have to create more and more trustable currency for each small country. And you have to prove why unified currency is comparatively better even for the small countries. Moving on my second argument, right? Sit down. I'm not going to take it anymore. Moving on to the second argument about its central bank that they create is God. Assumption coming from that side of the house is central bank has huge power and can be we can trust their power, right? We don't think so. The fact that people think unified currency can be trusted is something that's so dangerous. Why? Because countries do not have to engage in a monetary policy anymore. They can just ask for central bank whether or not they can lend money. Why? Because compare the two scenarios, right? On our side of the house, countries like countries who introduce a unified currency, countries under the status quo will self-determine that even if it's better to use money for the disaster area, or even if it's better to use money for other kind of area, we have to save the money in order to keep the balance of currency in our side of the house. But what's going to happen in that side of the house is those countries will just randomly use, because they do not have to think of monetary resources. Even if they go bankruptcy as a country, anyway, other countries as well as the central bank can help us so that I can do something that I can do whatever I want today. That's why deterrence for the crisis of each country, self-deterrence will not work in that side of the house, but rather in our side of the house. In order for the government to protect the citizens, they have to think about how the monetary resources should be used and how monetary or fiscal policy should be utilized for the citizens, right? On that occasion, we think our side is much more better in protecting those kind of people, and burden of proof of that side is why unified currency is comparatively better than any other form of currency. That's why we're very proud of the
Thank you, member of opposition. Now I invite the government whip to summarize the government case for 7 minutes. Yeah.
Wonderful CA for giving us this wonderful work. That all of us are having a great time. Okay? But I'll just go on. We'll talk about two things from closing government. Firstly, about sovereignty and whether it's even important or not. And secondly, about the crises. Which side makes crises worse? Which side makes them better? Which side prevents them at all? Which we think is the main goal of making currencies universal. Okay, so let's go first into sovereignty. We think that the opening debate was largely uncomparative in this regard. Opening government said that right now in the status quo, large states like the United States and China have control over participation in the market because they can shut out other countries like Taiwan from getting access to their currencies. We think that's not really mutually exclusive when these countries can do this in other ways, for example, like having tariffs or having trade restrictions and stuff. But furthermore, like opening opposition said, like the ECB is still going to be controlled by the US. Like it's also the ECB is still controlled, for example, in the status quo by Germany, by great countries. That's still going to happen on both sides. We think the same problem also applies for opening opposition, because they said that, okay, on our side of the house, the ECB is going to be controlled by US and China. But what happens on their side of the house? On their side of the house, the problem that opening government says is going to happen. So that means that on both sides of the house, this problem is not really going to be solved, which is kind of obvious given that big states tend to control the economy of the world a little more than little states. We think that's just going to happen on both sides of the house, and this motion isn't really going to change anything regardless of that. But we think the problem, and the main point here, is what happens when we actually have a unified central bank and how this bank will work. Because we think that only Kurihara gave you that extension, especially in contrast to closing opposition. How will this bank work, right? We think that we're not talking about Greece. The reason that the ECB failed was because it was done in a manner that kind of went on a historical basis. So you had first the customs union, then the currency union, and all of those things didn't really progress in a manner that was cohesive. We think the problem was Greece was able to set interest rates on its own and able to borrow wantonly without really caring about other people, and therefore had a lot of debt that it could not return, and also cooked its books, which is the reason why Greece failed, right? That's not going to happen in a world in which we already had the central bank to begin with, and we already presumably probably knew about these problems, and would not allow countries to set interest rates for themselves, which means that countries would not borrow at irresponsible rates, and which means that crises like Greece would be less likely to occur under our side of the house when these rates were different between countries, but you still had a universal currency on your own. We think that this is the kind of central bank that we want. But why is it? Sure, we think on our side of the house autonomy would be lost. But we don't think that sovereignty is always the most important thing, and we don't think it's always great, especially when it comes at the cost of the good of the people. And we think that this was the most important part of this debate. And this was what Kurihara particularly filled in, right? It's bad that governments, for example, in the status quo, irresponsibly lower interest rates, irresponsibly borrow easily from other countries, and therefore, for example, fall into a situation like Venezuela, in which they have crises that are caused by these governments, right? We think that sovereignty actually worse under their side of the house when these irresponsible governments, dictatorships sometimes, have control over this. We think this is something that they should not have control over. We think actually international, government workers would actually do a better job under our side of the house when they have kind of knowledge and economic expertise and do this without being relegated to populism. We think that's a comparatively better scenario under our side. Secondly, let's talk about crises. Why are crises actually worse on opposition side? We think Kurihara clearly gave you this analysis because what occurs right now is a money game. What happens is countries' money is devalued and valued by investors, and individual investors use money as betting tools. They buy this money cheap from some countries, they dump it into other countries, and the thing that occurs is that already in the status quo, sovereignty and the ability to set rates and the ability to control your own currency is non-existent to start with. So we think that's particularly why opposition side was not comparative within this debate. So we think that what happens right now is that if there's even the slightest indication that there's a disturbance in the economy of one country, for example, Argentina, for example, Turkey right now, what happens is these investors suddenly pull their money out, which means that the money drops all of a sudden, which means that financial crisis is precipitated because of the very fact that there are differing currencies. This is a problem that is unique to this motion because it only occurs because people can trade these different currencies for different values. They can add interest rates, they can devalue them. We think that is the very problem that exists right now.
We concede that there are bad traders that doing what you are talking about, but at least on our side, we have central bank from like different countries that have better power than this bad business.
No, we think the problem is that these non-central bankers, these investors, are having control over the ability of these central bankers to be able to exert money. So what happens is if these investors devalue the currency enough, that means that, so these central bankers have to answer to that and lower the currency even more, which means that the value drops even more and even more investors drop it. So that creates a kind of cycle, in which all of the money becomes even more cheaper and the people within this country, crucially, feel the worst, right? Because this means that the money they use to buy their daily bread, to get their salaries, all of this drops and all of this becomes inflated, which gives you the crises that are occurring since the 1970s and 80s, especially in developing countries. We think that we save them best when we have a unified currency, when we do not have to have this kind of trading, unfair trading. So what happens if there is an independent central bank, right? We think Kurihara told you that there's a less of an incentive to long and short, which means that there's no ability to trade between different currencies, so the kind of crises that occur right now because there are different currencies will not occur. But secondly, we think that it's more likely that you will be able to prevent crises because the central bank presumably will have control over interest rates and therefore prevent irresponsible government lending to an extent that central banks are unable to, especially in developing countries right now. So what happens is, for example, in countries like Venezuela, the central bank can't say anything to Maduro because he's going to cut their salaries and probably kill their families. So we think that that kind of thing is not going to happen on our side when these people are in Europe or in America and when they're relatively safe. And we think it's actually possible on our side of the house, unlike what opening opposition said, for these international institutions to be able to cater to the interests of these developing countries. If we see the IMF and the World Bank right now, these all have country institutions that do understand what's occurring in these countries. They do have the data. We think this capability would even exist under our side of the house. So we think that furthermore, on our side of the house, what would happen is these central banks would have the capability to inject liquidity within these areas in a time of perceived crisis. So they would be able to attack the crisis even before it happened. So that means it's likelier that they will be able to prevent the crises from spreading to other countries, which is exactly what happens right now. The contagion that happens because you have different currencies and because people just want to flock their currencies to other places. This is exactly what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. We can prevent things like that under our side of the house when you only have one unified currency. So what have we told you today? We've told you that firstly, sovereignty doesn't matter, but even if it does, it's done better on our side of the house. But secondly, we told you that crises actually don't happen, happen less under our side of the house and happen or much easier mitigated on our side of the house. This is why we're proud to propose this motion.
Thank you, Government Whip. Now I invite the last speaker of this round to finalize this grand final for 7 minutes.
Following Maya, I'd like to thank the AC for giving us this wonderful motion. I have never been more excited to be here. Okay, now we move on to our arguments. So first, so we think that from the closing opposition, we gave you the crux of the argument that was discussed throughout this entire debate, right? Because first of all, from the opening government, we talked about power imbalance and how vulnerable countries will not be able to survive. So from my wonderful partner, we talked about how this power imbalance is actually going to be worse off on our paradigm, and it will actually lead to more vulnerable countries being more vulnerable under our paradigm, right? But secondly, we also gave you the realistic. We were the first and only team that gave you the analysis of the realistic doubt on the feasibility of central banks on their paradigm, right? Because they are talking under the assumption that this central bank is God and that it will work and it will be perfect, right? But we don't believe that's the case. But on our paradigm, what we can do is that even if, the European Commission doesn't work, even if the Bank of Japan doesn't work, there is a way to opt out because there is a stronger currency that is left out. But on their paradigm, what's going to happen is if the central bank of this world fails, then all the world fails. And there's not a lot of ways to opt out because monetary policy based on countries is a lot more difficult to implement on their paradigm, right? And so we believe that when we think of the worst case, our side is comparatively better. And so that is why we're very proud to propose. So and from my speech, I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, why vulnerable countries will be worse off on their paradigm, and how our paradigm is comparatively better because this is a comparative debate. And then secondly, which side can prevent this economic crisis that we have been talking about in the closing debate. So first of all, why vulnerable countries will be worse off on their paradigm. So from the opening government, we talked about how most vulnerable countries have no control over their currencies under the status quo because of the strong, the US, China, and whatever, right? But first of all, we say that it's not true, right? Because they do have control to a certain extent of their currencies because, Southeast Asia, Asian nations, that kind of thing. These countries do have control of their monetary policies. These countries do have sovereignty, and it works in the first place, right? And they can implement trade policies and that kind of thing. They do have the freedom to do whatever they want under the status quo, right? But secondly, even if this this vacuum of power is actually happening on their paradigm, we say that our side is comparatively better, right? Because on their paradigm, what's actually going to happen is that because there's going to be a central bank and all of the countries will be using the same currency, these powerful nations have more leverage on the weaker nations because they're going to be helping them if they're in a bad situation, in an economic situation, and they're going to say, okay, if we're going to help you, you're going to have to listen to what we say a lot more than on our paradigm, where the richer countries can choose whether to help them or not, and the countries still have the sovereignty and the right to actually choose what they have to do, right? But secondly, we say that on their paradigm it's going to work off because, as my partner has actually extended, other policies will be deprioritized compared to the stronger nations policy. We gave you the example of Sweden. If Sweden wants more money, or example from the central bank or something, for the social benefit of their country, what's going to happen on their paradigms, maybe countries like the United States or China, because they have more power in the central bank, they say, no, we're not going to give you that money. We believe that that's an infringement on sovereignty. And why is that bad? We believe that that's part of the identity of that country, right? And we believe that that is a very necessary thing. No, thank you. But that's going to be sacrificed on their paradigm, but we can actually protect on our paradigm. No, thank you. Now, and fourthly, on our side, we have told you that in the case these countries fail, in the worst case scenario, we say that our side provides the only way for the countries to opt out of that bad cycle, right? Because so we gave you the example of Zimbabwe. So, right, like Zimbabwe was in a very bad situation, economic situation, but because they had the chance to opt out and change, or like they could have chosen to keep using their own money, they could have chosen to I don't know, take the US dollar, and they chose to use the US dollar, and now their economy is back on track again, right? We believe that on our side, we can give that option to these countries, while on their paradigm, if Zimbabwe fails, if the whole central bank fails, the whole, I don't know, the whole entire world is going to keep on failing. So yes, closing.
You just said it yourself. Zimbabwe started using the US dollar. This motion just means that every single country will start doing what Zimbabwe did and start using the US dollar.
Okay, so you just ignored what I've been talking about, is that, so this, but on, like, there is a fundamental flaw in like the idea that central banks will actually work all the time, right? And so that's why what we're saying is that if the central bank doesn't work, there's no way for countries to opt out on their paradigm, right? What we want to protect is the idea that countries can actually opt out of this kind of bad system, and this is something that we can only achieve on our paradigm, right? But secondly, which side can actually prevent this economic crisis, right? Because that's what the CZ was talking about. Oh yeah, so the conclusion of the first class is that we say that the vulnerable countries will be actually better off on our paradigm because they can actually protect their sovereignty, and also they have a chance to opt out if the economy is worse off, and also they're not being leveraged a lot more by the bigger countries don't have as much leverage as they do. They will have more leverage on their paradigm to control the vulnerable countries than they do comparatively on our paradigm. But secondly, so which side can actually prevent this crisis, right? Because the CG talked about how economic crisis is likely to happen on their paradigm, less likely to happen on their paradigm because there is a stable currency, right? But the presumption is that the stable currency is going to be stable all the time, right? But what if countries like the United States, which they believe is going to be stable all the time, goes into an economic recession, right? But when this happens, that means the whole entire economy, depending on this central bank that the US or China controls, is going to go down, right? And we believe that their assumption is very faulty in the first place, right? But if all of these countries fail easier, it's very difficult to solve because they're so if the U.S. wants to do economic monetary policies, or when there's a central bank, it's very much more difficult, I don't know, maybe increase more money or that kind of thing to regulate. And so it's a lot more difficult to actually fix whatever that is the problem. While on our paradigm, the U.S. can fix themselves because they have more leeway in moving their monetary policies and et cetera, right? And so we believe that this assumption that the central banks will be stable is faulty in the first place, right? But secondly, we also told you from the closing opposition that self-deterrence for each country will not work on their paradigm because each country or the weaker countries will think that the bigger countries will save them even if they do bad monetary policies. And we believe that that will actually increase more chances for economic crises to happen. And so that is why we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you for the speech. Now all speeches are over.